This is my true story. My son looked me in the eyes while I lay on the floor and told me to stop pretending I was sick. He stepped over me like I was nothing more than a shadow in his way. The same boy I once carried on my shoulders now couldn't bend his knees to help me. I stayed silent, even as pain burned through my chest. He thought he had seen weakness. He mistook patience for surrender. But he didn't know what I was about to do that will destroy him. Before I tell you what happened the next morning, tell me where you're watching from, and please subscribe so more people hear my story. It happened on a quiet morning, the kind that begins like any other. The sun had just started to rise, painting the window with pale gold, and the house was still. I had gotten up to make tea, but my legs trembled halfway through the hallway. Before I knew it, the cup slipped from my hand and shattered on the floor. The next moment, I was down too. My chest tightened, and my breath caught somewhere between pain and disbelief. I called his name, once, softly, then louder. My voice echoed through the walls that I had built for him. I heard footsteps approach, and for a brief second, I thought I was safe. He stood over me, still half asleep, his face blank. I told him I couldn't move, that something was wrong. He looked down, exhaled hard, and said, "Stop pretending." Those two words hit harder than the fall itself. Then he turned away, grabbed his jacket, and walked past me. His shoes crushed the pieces of glass scattered across the floor, the same glass from the cup I had dropped. I heard the door open, then close, and the house was quiet again. Too quiet. I tried to move, but my body refused to listen. My hand reached for the chair nearby, but even that was too far. My back ached, my heart raced, and the world started to dim around the edges. I had fallen before in my life, from ladders, from rooftops, even from fortune. But this fall was different. It wasn't the body that broke this time. It was something smaller, deeper, quieter. The part of me that still believed my son cared. Minutes stretched into hours. I stared at the ceiling, counting the wooden beams I had once nailed in myself. Every one of them felt like a reminder of years that no longer mattered. My mind went back to when he was young, how he used to run to me whenever he got hurt, how he'd cry if I didn't pick him up fast enough. Back then, I was his strength. Now, I was a burden lying on the floor, waiting for a son who wouldn't come back. The irony burned through me. The hands that had once caught him every time he fell were now reaching out to nothing. The cold from the floor crept up my spine. My breath grew slower, but my thoughts wouldn't stop. I thought of his mother, how she would have scolded him if she saw this. She had raised him to be kind, to respect the old, to protect family. Somewhere along the way, comfort had replaced values, and pride had replaced love. Maybe it was my fault. Maybe I had made his life too easy. Maybe I had built his world so well that he forgot who built it. At some point, I stopped calling for him. My throat hurt, and the silence had already given me my answer. No one was coming. I looked at the clock on the wall. The same clock he used to point at when he was a boy, asking if it was time to play. Now it mocked me with its ticking. Every second was a reminder that I had become invisible in my own house. But as time passed, something strange happened. The pain didn't fade, but the fear did. I stopped feeling like a victim. I started seeing the truth. This fall wasn't just an accident. It was a mirror. It showed me who I had become in his eyes and what I needed to stop being. I realized that this moment, this weakness, would become the turning point of my life. I would no longer beg for care or respect. If I had to crawl through the rest of my days, I'd do it without asking anyone to lift me. That morning, when I finally pulled myself up by gripping the corner of the table, I looked at my reflection in the glass cabinet. My face was pale, my eyes sunken, but behind them, there was something new. Clarity. The kind that comes when a man understands that love doesn't always survive arrogance. I stood there, steady but shaking, and whispered to myself, "He thinks I'm pretending." I didn't know it yet, but that sentence would become the start of my greatest act of truth. He stepped over me that morning like I was nothing. Not a father, not a man who had given him everything, just an old inconvenience lying in his path. The sound of his shoes scraping against the floor was louder than his words. The door slammed behind him, sharp and final, like a hammer striking the last nail into a coffin. For a few seconds after he left, I didn't even feel the pain in my body anymore. Only the echo of that sound. That closing door became a line in my life. Before it, I was a father. After it, I was a burden. I stayed there for a while, half sitting, half collapsed, staring at the place where he had stood. His breakfast plate was still on the table. The smell of toast still hung in the air. Everything looked the same, but nothing was. The house had turned into a stranger. The walls I once built for protection now felt like a cage that had learned to keep me in silence. I could hear the clock ticking somewhere in the background, every tick pressing down harder on my chest, reminding me that he hadn't come back. It's strange how time slows when you realize no one is coming for you. The house begins to breathe differently. The air feels thicker. The quiet starts to hum like a living thing. I kept looking toward the door, thinking maybe he would remember, maybe guilt would bring him back. But the handle never turned. Pride doesn't look back. And the kind of pride he carried, it blinds, deafens, and destroys everything that loves it. I dragged myself toward the wall, my palms burning against the rough floor. The pain in my ribs sharpened with every breath. Still, I kept moving. I wasn't crawling to survive. I was crawling to understand how I had created this. How the boy who once waited at the window for me to come home from work now walked out without care when I needed him most. Every inch forward was a reminder that I had built my own sorrow, brick by brick, through forgiveness, excuses, and blind love. I had raised him to think care was weakness. I had given him everything without asking for anything back. And now that I needed something as small as help standing up, he couldn't give me that either. By the time I reached the sofa, my arms shook so hard that I could barely pull myself up. When I finally managed to sit, sweat ran down my face, and the whole room spun. But my thoughts were steady. I looked at the photo frame on the shelf, me, his mother, and him, smiling in front of the house when it was first built. I remembered how small he was then, how his hand fit perfectly inside mine. I remembered the promise I made to his mother before she died, that I would raise him well, teach him to be strong, kind, responsible. Somewhere along the years, he learned strength but forgot kindness. As evening came, the pain in my body dulled, but the ache in my heart stayed sharp. I didn't cry. Old men like me don't have tears left after a lifetime of endurance. We just sit, stare, and absorb the truth until it hardens into silence. And that's what I did. I sat there, motionless, while the sun went down and shadows filled the house. Each shadow felt like a memory of what used to be. Birthday candles, laughter, her voice singing in the kitchen, all gone, replaced by the hollow quiet of a home that no longer wanted its builder. When the night finally came, I turned off the lights and sat in darkness. I could still hear the faint sound of that door closing replaying in my head. The image of him stepping over me wouldn't leave. But neither would the thought that maybe, just maybe, this humiliation was the beginning of something greater. Sometimes life has to crush you to remind you what you still have the strength to stand for. I lay back on the couch, body broken but mind awake, realizing that pain doesn't just reveal truth, it demands change. And from that moment on, change was coming. That night felt longer than any I had lived through. The house was too still, too quiet, like it was holding its breath and waiting to see what I would do next. I sat in the same chair for hours, afraid to move, not because of the pain in my body, but because of what moving meant. It meant accepting that everything had changed. The clock on the wall ticked slow and cruel, marking every second I spent alone. I could hear the wind brushing against the windows, the faint creak of wood shifting with the cold. Everything around me was alive, except for the warmth that once filled this house. My body ached from the fall, but the real weight was in my chest. I had given my life to build something for him, not just the roof and the walls, but the life inside it. Now, the same place that used to echo with laughter was a room full of ghosts. I stared at the spot on the floor where I had fallen, where he had stood. where he had looked down at me without care. That image played over and over in my head, each time cutting deeper. The shame was worse than the pain. Not because I was on the floor, but because he had seen me there and felt nothing. I tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, blank, cold, distant. I saw the boy who used to bring me tools while I worked in the yard. The one who used to wait by the window when I was late coming home. Somewhere along the way, that boy had vanished, replaced by a man who thought kindness was weakness. I kept wondering when it happened. Was it the day I gave him his first car? The day I helped him pay off his debt? Or maybe it was the day I started saying yes just to keep the peace. Every father has a moment where he stops being needed. But I hadn't expected to stop being human. The hours crawled by. The pain in my ribs sharpened every time I breathed, and my hands trembled when I tried to drink water. I thought about calling for help, but the phone sat on the counter too far to reach without risking another fall. I told myself I would make it through the night. I had survived worse in life: hunger, poverty, loss. I could survive this too. But it wasn't the body I was worried about. It was the part of me that still believed in family, the small piece that kept hoping the door would open again. By midnight, the cold from the floor had crept into the room. I pulled the old blanket around me and closed my eyes. That's when the memories started coming. Not like comfort, but like punishment. I saw his mother's smile the day we brought him home from the hospital. I heard his first word. I remembered the way he used to call me hero when I fixed things around the house. It's strange how pain digs up love. It drags it out from places you buried years ago, forcing you to look at it one last time. I realized then that I had been clinging to memories that no longer belonged to me. He had already let go. I was the one still holding on. Around 3 a.m, I finally stood up. Slowly, using the chair as support, I pushed myself up inch by inch until I was on my feet again. My knees shook, my breathing heavy, but I didn't fall. When I looked at my reflection in the window, I barely recognized myself. I saw a man drained, but not defeated. The humiliation had turned into something sharper: resolve. The kind that doesn't come with noise, only with clarity. I knew right then that the father he had left on the floor would not be the same man who stood up. Something inside me had died quietly that night. The need to be loved, the hope to be respected. What replaced it was something far stronger: the will to act, not for revenge, but for self-respect. I turned off the lights, sat down again, and whispered to myself, "Enough." The word echoed softly in the dark, but its meaning was loud. It was the sound of the end of weakness and the beginning of something my son had never seen: my strength. The sun came through the curtains the next morning, weak and white, like it was afraid to touch the room. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands resting on my knees, staring at the light crawling across the floor. Everything hurt, but I didn't reach for painkillers. I wanted to feel it: every bruise, every ache, every reminder of what had happened. Pain had become my teacher. It was the only thing that spoke the truth anymore. I had spent years softening myself for the people I loved, and all it ever gave me was silence when I needed help the most. That morning I stopped being soft. When I looked at my reflection in the mirror, I didn't see sickness. I saw survival. The face staring back at me wasn't broken. It was unfinished. I washed up slowly, letting the cold water sting my skin. I didn't need sympathy. I needed clarity. Every movement felt heavier than it should, but with every breath, something inside me grew steadier. I realized that my son had given me a gift without knowing it. His cruelty had burned away the last of my weakness. He thought leaving me on that floor would make me smaller. But it made me dangerous in the quietest way. I brewed tea, the same way I had done for decades, the same steps, the same patience. But the man who lifted the cup to his lips that morning was not the same man who fell the day before. I took slow sips and thought about everything I had done for him. Every debt paid, every night spent worrying, every sacrifice that kept him comfortable. I thought about how many times I told myself that he would change, that one day he would see the truth. That day never came. Instead, he had given me my answer. So I decided to give him his lesson. Not through anger, not through shouting, but through silence, through law, through power he couldn't see coming. When the clock struck 9, I walked to my study. The room smelled of old books and dust, the kind of air that remembers things long forgotten. I opened the bottom drawer of the desk, the one I hadn't touched in years. Inside was a stack of papers, yellowed at the edges, documents that still held my name. The house deed, the savings accounts, the company shares. All mine, all untouched. I stared at them for a long time, the edges rough under my fingers. I realized how foolish I had been to think love replaced responsibility. He thought everything I had would one day belong to him. He was wrong. The idea came slowly, not as a burst of anger, but as calm as a sunrise. If I was pretending to be sick, as he claimed, then I could also pretend to be weak no longer. I would show him what real strength looked like. I wouldn't raise my voice. I wouldn't argue. I would let the law speak where my words no longer mattered. I picked up the phone and dialed my lawyer's number, an old friend who had handled my affairs for years. When he answered, I told him we needed to update my will. My voice didn't shake. I didn't need to explain why. He just said, "Understood." That was enough. After hanging up, I sat back in the chair and felt a strange peace wash over me. There was no anger left, only clarity. I realized that revenge doesn't always come with violence. Sometimes it's just the quiet act of taking back control from those who think they own you. My son had mistaken my silence for surrender. He had no idea that the same silence was now writing the next chapter of his life, one where I no longer existed for him in the ways that mattered. By the time the morning light filled the room, my decision was complete. I folded the papers neatly, placed them back in the drawer, and locked it. My hands were steady now. My chest didn't ache the same way. I had been left on the floor once, but I would never be there again. The man who fell was gone. The man who stood up had nothing left to lose, and that made him unstoppable. The drawer had been sealed for years. Dust clung to the edges, and the key felt cold in my hand as I turned it. Inside lay the life I had built, not in memories, but in papers. Neat stacks of documents, each one carrying my signature from a different chapter of my life. Titles, deeds, insurance, savings, and one envelope marked Last Will and Testament. I had written it a long time ago when my wife was still alive, when hope still had a home in this house. Back then, I believed family was a bond stronger than law. That blood was a promise. But sitting there that morning, I knew promises meant nothing when respect dies. I pulled out the envelope and opened it carefully. My eyes ran down the list of names. My son, his wife, the grandchildren I rarely saw. Everything I had earned was divided neatly between them. I remembered how proud I'd felt when I first wrote it, thinking I was securing their future. I didn't realize I was securing my own humiliation. I read through the pages slowly, every line heavier than the last. His name appeared again and again, the house, the shares, the savings. He would have inherited everything. He already acted like he had. Maybe that was my mistake, giving him the comfort of ownership before he had earned it. I sat back and let the thought settle. The papers were proof of a man who had lived with trust, not wisdom. I had worked all my life believing that giving was love, that sacrifice was strength. But I had forgotten the simplest truth, that ungrateful hearts only grow hungrier. He never said thank you for anything I gave him. Why would he? I never made him earn it. I handed him comfort on a silver plate and then wondered why he had no empathy when I fell. That morning, the truth wasn't painful anymore. It was freeing. I went through each page, one by one, studying my own handwriting. I could almost hear my younger self speaking through those words, kind, hopeful, naive. I smiled faintly and whispered, "You were a good man, but too gentle." Then I picked up a pen and began crossing out his name. Line after line, stroke after stroke, I erased him from the paper the same way he had erased me from his heart. Each strike of ink felt lighter, cleaner, like air returning to my lungs. When I was done, the page looked different. Empty in places, but honest. My lawyer's number was written at the top, and I knew one call would be enough to make this official. I picked up the phone and dialed. His voice on the other end was calm and respectful, the way only people who know your worth still speak to you. I told him I needed to revise my will immediately. He asked if I was sure. I told him I had never been more certain in my life. There was a pause, the kind of pause that holds understanding. He said he would prepare everything by the afternoon. I thanked him quietly and hung up. I sat there for a long while afterward, staring at the sunlight coming through the blinds. It painted stripes across the old documents, illuminating the ink that had built my life. I thought about how easily paper holds power, how a few words can build a home or break a legacy. My son believed strength was in control, in shouting, in commanding others. But the truth sat right here, in the silence of a pen. Before I left the study, I gathered every document with my name on it and placed them in a small leather folder. It felt light in my hands, almost too light for what it carried. I locked the drawer again, but this time it wasn't out of fear, it was out of finality. The man who once wrote this, Will, had done it out of love. The man holding it now was writing out of clarity. As I stood up and looked around the room, I noticed the old photograph on the shelf, my wife smiling beside me, her hand resting gently on my shoulder. I touched the glass and whispered, "I'm fixing it now." Then I turned off the light, left the room, and closed the door behind me. The papers were ready. So was I. That afternoon, I took the bus to town. The ride was slow, quiet, and steady, the kind of silence that lets you think clearly. I sat near the window, watching fields pass by. The same fields I once worked to feed the family that no longer saw me as their own. My hands rested on the leather folder across my lap. Inside it lay everything my son thought he would one day own. I didn't feel anger as I held it, just purpose. There's a strange kind of peace that comes when you stop hoping for apologies and start building closure. The lawyer's office was a small building with fading paint and a bell that chimed softly when I walked in. The air smelled faintly of paper and dust. He looked up from his desk, adjusted his glasses, and stood with a kind smile. "You're early," he said. I nodded and handed him the folder. No small talk, no hesitation. He opened it, read the label, and understood immediately. We had known each other for years. He had handled everything from my house deed to my pension. He had also known my wife. He knew what this meant. He didn't ask why. Instead, he said quietly, "You're ready to make changes." I said yes. He brought out a new set of clean pages and placed them before me. The sound of paper sliding across the desk felt like the closing of a chapter. I opened the folder, took out the will, and laid it beside the blank sheets. His name, my son's name, stared up at me one last time. It didn't hurt anymore. The pain had burned itself out. All that was left was resolve. The lawyer began writing as I spoke, slowly, carefully, no emotion. Every word replaced an old mistake. The house, reassigned, the savings, redirected. The company shares, dissolved and placed in a charitable trust. Every signature I added felt lighter. For years I had carried guilt for being too harsh, too demanding, too silent. But in that room, with the sound of pens scratching against paper, I felt something new. Control. Not the kind that dominates others, but the kind that finally protects you from being hurt again. When it was done, he turned the papers toward me. "Is this what you want?" he asked softly. I read every line, every clause, every name. My son's name wasn't there anymore. It had vanished from every inheritance, every asset, every tie that bound him to my legacy. I nodded. "It's exactly what I want." My voice didn't tremble. My hands didn't shake. I signed each page, slowly, deliberately, letting the ink soak into the paper like a seal on the end of an era. When I finished, the lawyer looked at me and said, "You've done what most men can't." I smiled faintly. "No," I said. "I've just learned what they should have done sooner." He offered to make me tea, but I declined. I didn't need comfort. I needed silence. I sat for a while longer, listening to the faint hum of the ceiling fan, the shuffle of papers, the world still turning as mine quietly changed forever. Then I stood, shook his hand, and left. Outside, the air felt different, lighter, the kind of air you breathe after a storm ends. The town moved as it always had. People walking, cars passing, life indifferent to the private revolutions happening in quiet rooms. I looked around and smiled slightly. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about what my son would think or what anyone would say. I was thinking only of how peaceful it felt to have nothing left for him to take. As I walked toward the bus stop, I passed a father holding his small son's hand. The boy tripped, and the man bent instantly to help him up. The sight hit me like a memory, sharp, soft, and far away. I turned my head and kept walking. The man I used to be might have looked back. The man I had become didn't. Some things are meant to stay buried, even love. When the bus arrived, I climbed aboard and sat by the window again. The folder, now light with new pages, rested on my lap. My reflection stared back at me through the glass. Older, colder, but freer. My son once told me to stop pretending. He was right. I wasn't pretending anymore. The next morning, I woke before the alarm. My mind was clear, my hands steady, my body no longer trembling from the fall that had humiliated me days ago. The decision had already been made, sealed, signed, and delivered to truth itself. I brewed my tea, set it on the table, and watched the steam curl upward like smoke from something that had finally burned away. The papers sat neatly in front of me. The new will, the new order of my life. Every word of it carried peace. Every signature carried weight. I stared at it for a long time before picking up the phone. It was time to let him know. I dialed his number, and for a moment my finger hesitated over the last digit. Then I pressed it. The ring felt longer than usual, drawn out like the last thread between two people. He answered, his voice casual at first, the kind of tone that belongs to a man who believes the world still belongs to him. I told him I needed him to come home, that I had something important to read to him. There was a pause, short, sharp, the sound of suspicion. Then he said he'd be there. I could almost hear him thinking it was about his inheritance, about security, about control. That was good. Let him come. Let him walk into the silence he created. When he arrived, he walked in with the same arrogance he always carried. Shoulders high, steps quick, phone in hand, eyes glancing at everything but me. "You said it was important," he muttered, dropping his keys on the counter. I nodded and pointed to the chair across from me. He sat down slowly, maybe sensing that something was different. I opened the folder, unfolded the papers, and began to read. At first, his expression was bored, distracted. But when I reached the first line, "I, being of sound mind, do hereby revoke all previous wills and testaments," his face changed. The casual smile faded. His shoulders stiffened. I kept reading, each word calm and deliberate, the kind of calm that cuts deeper than anger. The more I read, the smaller he looked. His eyes darted between the paper and my face, as if searching for some hint of mercy that wasn't there. When I said the words, "All property, savings, and assets are to be transferred elsewhere," his voice broke. "What?" he whispered. I didn't stop. I read through the rest, line after line, detail after detail. Every clause, every transfer, every name that wasn't his. By the time I finished, his face was pale, his hands clenched. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument we'd ever had. He tried to speak, his voice shaking, but the words came out fractured. You changed everything?" I looked at him, steady, unblinking. "I changed what was mine," I said softly. He leaned back in the chair, running his hand through his hair, disbelief and fear mixing into something unfamiliar. Humility. For the first time, he wasn't looking down at me. He was looking up, from the floor of his pride, realizing how far he had fallen. The air between us grew still. No anger, no shouting, just the quiet sound of consequences settling in. He opened his mouth again but couldn't find words. The man who once told me to stop pretending to be sick now sat trembling, speechless, watching his future vanish in front of him. And I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I simply watched. The same way he had watched me on that floor. With silence. He whispered something, an apology maybe, or an excuse. But I didn't listen. I looked past him, out the window, at the same sunlight that had once poured through this house when it was full of love. The same light now revealed what was left. Two strangers sitting across a table, bound by blood, but broken by pride. I folded the papers carefully, placed them back in the folder, and stood up. "It's done," I said. He didn't move. As I walked past him, I could hear his breath tremble. The man who once thought I was weak was now too stunned to stand. Every step I took toward the door was lighter than the one before. When I reached the hallway, I paused, not to look back, but to listen. And what I heard wasn't words, but the sound of realization. The same sound I had made days earlier, lying on the floor, when I realized I was alone. Except this time, it wasn't me who felt it. It was him. He came back that evening. I heard the knock before I even saw his shadow stretch across the porch. 3 knocks, loud, uneven, desperate. The kind of knock a man gives when he realizes power no longer listens to him. I didn't answer right away. I let him stand there for a while, breathing heavily, probably rehearsing words he had never said before. Finally, I opened the door. His eyes were red, his shirt half untucked, his face pale and tired. Pride had left him somewhere between the drive here and the first knock. What stood before me wasn't the man who mocked me. It was the boy I used to know, the one who looked lost after scraping his knee. Only now, the wound was pride, not skin. He stepped inside without being asked. His hands trembled as he spoke, voice cracking like it hadn't in years. "Dad, I was wrong," he said. But the words didn't sound like an apology. They sounded like fear. Fear of what it meant to finally be powerless. He kept talking, about how he hadn't meant it, about how stress made him cruel, about how he thought I was fine that day. Each sentence stumbled into the next, tripping over guilt and excuses. I didn't interrupt. I didn't even blink. I just watched him, the way he had watched me lying on that cold floor. My silence filled the space between us like a mirror, forcing him to see himself the way I saw him that morning. He moved closer, his voice shaking harder. "Please, Dad, I'll do better," he whispered. Then his knees gave out. Right there on the same floor he once left me lying on, he knelt. His hands reached for mine, gripping tight, trembling. His forehead touched my fingers, and his tears fell on the same tiles where my pain had been ignored. The circle had closed. The same floor that once held my humiliation now held his. He had thought strength came from stepping over me. Now he knew real strength comes from standing alone, and that he never had it. I looked down at him, and for a long time I said nothing. The years of fatherhood flashed through my mind like flickering film reels. Teaching him to ride a bike, working late nights to pay for his schooling, sitting through his mother's funeral with him sleeping on my shoulder. Every sacrifice I had made for him had led to this moment. He had spent his life taking without gratitude, speaking without listening, and living without reflection. But now, silence had finally found him. I let him cry. I let him tremble. I let him understand. He begged to be put back into the will. He promised to care for me, to make things right, to never repeat what he had done. His words spilled out too fast, too desperate, the kind of promises that come only when consequences arrive. I could have softened then. I could have told him it was all forgiven. But forgiveness isn't what he needed. He needed to feel what I felt, the weight of being unheard. So I let his voice echo unanswered. Minutes passed before he stopped talking. The only sound left was his breathing, heavy and broken. He looked up, eyes wet, searching for the father who once fixed everything. But that father was gone. The man standing above him now was finished with rescuing the ungrateful. My silence wasn't cruelty. It was justice. The same justice that comes when you stop carrying people who never learn to walk on their own. Finally, I took my hand back and said quietly, "Stand up." He obeyed, slow and ashamed, wiping his face. His posture had changed. His voice had lost its edge. For the first time, he looked small, not in size, but in spirit. I pointed toward the door. He hesitated, hoping for something, anything, a last word, a sign of forgiveness. But I had given enough words in my lifetime. This time, I gave him silence, the kind he gave me. He walked out with his head down, his hands shaking, closing the door behind him without a sound. The night swallowed his footsteps, and the house returned to quiet. But it wasn't the same silence as before. This one was clean. This one was mine. I sat down in my chair, the same chair I had struggled to reach after he left me on the floor. The difference now was simple. He was the one crawling, and I was the one standing. He came again the next morning, earlier than before, as if sleep hadn't touched him all night. The knock was softer this time, cautious, unsure. I opened the door and found him standing there with the same eyes I used to see when he was a child, caught doing something wrong. But there was no innocence left, only desperation. He looked smaller somehow, not because of age or size, but because the arrogance that once filled his shoulders had drained away. He stood in silence, waiting for me to speak. I didn't. I stepped aside and let him in. His eyes moved around the house, landing on every memory that still hung in the air. The photographs, the furniture, the old clock ticking like a witness. He started talking, not the way sons speak to fathers, but the way guilty men speak to judges. His words came out in pieces, soft and pleading. He said he hadn't meant to be cruel, that he was tired, that he thought I would be fine. He called himself foolish. He called himself ashamed. He even tried to laugh once, nervously, like laughter might dissolve the truth that hung between us. I listened, but my heart didn't move. The part of me that used to feel for him had already burned out. I was only there to see if he would say what really mattered, not excuses, not justifications, the truth. He didn't. He talked about regret, about wanting things back, about how blood should matter more than anger. But blood had been spilled long before he arrived at my door, not in violence, but in pride. I watched him pace across the same floor where he once stepped over me, his movements frantic, his breathing heavy. He stopped suddenly, turned toward me, and asked if there was still a chance. Just one. His voice cracked when he said it. He wanted me to tell him that everything would be fine, that fathers forgive no matter what. I stayed quiet. The quiet itself became my answer. He looked at me, waiting, hoping, begging for a single word. When none came, he fell to his knees again, his head bowed, his hands clasped like a child praying for mercy. "Please, Dad," he whispered. "I'll change. I'll do better." His words floated in the room like echoes that no longer belonged to me. I thought of all the times I had believed him before, when he promised to grow up, to stop wasting money, to visit more, to care more. Empty promises spoken by a man who only found kindness when consequence knocked first. I walked past him slowly and stood by the window. The sunlight was spilling through, warm and quiet. It touched the old photograph of his mother on the wall, her smile frozen in time, her hand resting on my shoulder. I wondered what she would have said if she had seen him now. Maybe she would have wanted me to forgive him. Maybe she would have reminded me that he was still our boy. But she wasn't here anymore, and I had already forgiven him, not to bring him closer, but to let him go without hate. He lifted his head, his eyes wet, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't mean it," he said. "You wouldn't really do this." I turned and looked at him for the last time. My face didn't carry anger. It carried peace, the kind of peace that comes when you finally stop trying to fix what refuses to change. I said nothing. I didn't need to. He understood. His shoulders dropped, his head lowered again, and for a moment, I saw all the years of pride collapse into one single truth. He had made himself small. He stood up slowly, wiped his eyes, and turned toward the door. Before he left, he stopped and looked back one last time. "Can I ever make it right?" he asked. I met his eyes and gave him the only mercy I had left. Not anymore. My voice was calm, final, and it cut softer than any anger ever could. He nodded once, his lips trembling, then walked out without another word. The door closed quietly behind him. No slam, no sound, just the soft click of endings. I looked around the room, the sunlight still warm on the table, and breathed. The silence that filled the house wasn't painful anymore. It was freedom. He had asked for another chance, but some chances, once wasted, don't return. Kindness had already been spent. He told me to stop pretending I was sick, and he left me on the floor. He thought I was weak. He thought I was helpless. But he didn't understand that sometimes the body bends so the spirit can rise. The day he stepped over me was the day I stopped being afraid of losing him. I had already lost him long before that. The moment pride replaced love. That morning on the cold tiles, I learned what no father wants to learn. Some sons only value you until they think you can't stand. So I stood again, quietly, and I never knelt for him after that. He learned too, only later, and too late. The day I read that will, I didn't just show him papers. I showed him the truth. The same hands he ignored were the ones that wrote his future. The same voice he dismissed was the one that erased his name. He called me weak, but he forgot where strength really lives. It doesn't live in shouting or money or power. It lives in control. In the ability to sit across from the man who once humiliated you and say nothing because silence has already spoken. Now my days are calm. I make my own breakfast. I sit in the garden. I breathe. I don't think about revenge. I think about freedom. How it feels lighter than love, quieter than pride. I don't check my phone waiting for his call. If he calls, he'll only find the silence he once left me in. I've learned that peace doesn't come from being understood. It comes from no longer needing to explain yourself. Sometimes when I walk past the old family photographs, I stop and look. I see his mother smiling, her arm around me, our son still small between us. I touch the glass and whisper, "He learned." Not because he changed, but because the world finally made him listen the way I once begged him to. Some lessons don't come from words. They come from loss. He left me on the floor, calling me a liar. So I left him on his knees, calling for forgiveness. He said I was pretending, until the will proved who was really helpless. And that's how silence gave me back my voice.